from Chester, Connecticut. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
Well, it's a program that has been on our air now well over a year, and we're proud to be able to host it on a monthly basis. Archaeology of Connecticut, powered by our friends at the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, and FOSA, an important part of the whole kind of science and culture ecosystem in Connecticut, and Friends of ICRV Radio, so we're thrilled to have them power Archaeology of Connecticut. And here's your host, Sarah Sportman. Sarah, how are you?
Good. How are you, Dave?
Doing fine, thanks.
Well, we welcome everybody to our May episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm Connecticut State Archaeologist, Sarah Sportman. Then I'm joined with my co-host, Scott Brady, the president of FOSA.
Hello, everybody.
This is our second show since the COVID-19 shutdown began. And due to continuing social distancing guidelines, everyone's calling in tonight. We're going to talk about ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, and its use in archaeology. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about what GPR is, how the technology works, and how it can help us learn more about archaeological sites and even guide our excavation strategies. We're going to discuss some recent case studies from Connecticut and also in Jamestown in Virginia, and then we'll take a look at the future of this technology in archaeology. So we're really excited for the show tonight. We've got two great guests. We're very pleased to be joined on the phones this evening by two very knowledgeable people. Peter Leach is an archaeologist who works at GSSI Incorporated in New Hampshire. This is one of the leading companies in the innovation and manufacture of just geophysical technology. And our other guest is Dr. David Leslie, who's been on the show before. He's a senior archaeologist at AHS in Connecticut. Both have a lot of experience, not only in using GPR technology, but applying it in innovative ways in archaeology. So if you wouldn't mind, Peter, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me. Again, Peter Leach here. I work at Geophysical Survey Systems in New Hampshire. We make ground-penetrating radar equipment, and as an archaeologist, that's what I primarily apply to study the past, figure out what's going on at site. I was kind of interested in the previously posted topic for, I think, today, underwater archaeology. That's actually my other research background, looking at submerged pre-contact sites, Native American sites underwater. But I got into ground-penetrating radar because at the University of Maine, I used seismic reflection profiling to look below the seafloor to look for landscapes that had been drowned by sea level rise over the last 12,000 years. And the first time I ever saw GPR equipment and looked at the data, I said, boy, I'll never use that. And lo and behold, here I am 15 years later, and I've used GPR on 5 continents, including Antarctica. Really excited to be here to talk to everyone about describing and understanding what GPR does. People see it on TV a lot, but hopefully we can mitigate some of the damage from the Hollywoodization of GPR that we always see on forensic shows. But I'm hoping that we get to really get down to the nuts and bolts and talk about some of the really cool things that it does in reality. But also, we're talking to Dr. Leslie as well today. He and I have a very similar background in a lot of ways. We also, I use geographic information systems. And I was a dirt archaeologist for many, many years until I started doing geophysics. And I'll tell you, as much as I like shoveling, I like doing non-invasive remote sensing, which means using equipment using technology to look somewhere where you don't have to do any disturbance to see it. And that's sort of where my career path has gone over the last decade or so, and just hoping to push the envelope and get more people asking stuff for GPR. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. Thanks for being on the show. Dave, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. As Sarah said, I'm a senior archaeologist at Archaeological and Historical Services. And as Peter was talking, I still consider myself mostly a dirt archaeologist, although I know that this is May 5th, we're this one day after May 4th to be with you. Peter is slowly bringing me to the dark side of geophysics year after year. One of the things that we wanted to do at AHS several years ago was really start to target our surveys in cultural resource management a little bit better using geophysical technology. So we've been working with a GPR machine that we purchased from Peter's company several years ago now on many different projects. Some of them, the more traditional projects that you see with cemeteries and looking for sort of prospecting for human grave shafts, but other ones sort of a little bit farther out there looking for pre-contact Native American features, as well as using them with historical archaeological sites to target sort of underground cellar features and other sort of mid-tips. So that's sort of where I come from using ground-penetrating radar these days.
Great, thank you. So as Peter was talking about, people that are familiar with ground-penetrating radar, it might be from television or other aspects like that, and it might not be the most nuanced understanding of how the technology works. And it is a complicated technology in many ways. But Peter, to start, can you give us a brief introduction to ground-penetrating radar technology and how it's used in archaeology?
Sure, yeah. GPR has been around a while, and people have heard of it, but may not really understand what it is. A lot of people think it maybe it's kind of like a metal detector, which is more something that people have had more familiar with in their lives. But to start off, I mean, GPR is an electromagnetic technique. It's radar. So you use an electrical source and a magnetic source, and they kind of work together. But it works a lot like an airplane-based, a ground-based airplane detection radar, where it sends a signal out, and whenever that signal speeds up or slows down, like when it hits a boundary between different materials, some of that energy gets reflected back to the antenna that's resting on the ground. The rest of the energy that's left over, if there's any left over, keeps going. And if it hits another boundary or a soil layer or a target like a rock, it'll reflect back. We do this in one spot. It sends it down until all the energy is exhausted or until the time that you are allowing it to listen for the signal is elapsed. And then using a distance encoding wheel, a really sophisticated distance measuring device, we'll move the antenna. It might be mounted on a cart. It might have a distance wheel mounted on the antenna, and you pull the antenna, and you pull or push the antenna or the cart, and then as soon as some distance increment is measured, like let's say 1 inch or 2 centimeters, the system will take another reading. And then you'll move that distance again, and it will take another reading. You can go at about a walking pace, maybe a little faster. But all of this is displayed to you in real time on a control unit. That might be a tablet or a computer or a custom-built control unit. So you see the record coming across the screen, and it's kind of like looking at, I don't know, a lot of the listeners, I'm sure, have looked down into a backhoe trench or looked at an eroded riverbank, where you see all of the soil layers kind of doing what they do. They're not always perfectly flat. There's inconsistencies. Radar shows you a representation, a pretty good representation of those layers, and also it shows as continuous features. It also shows targets. And so GPR acts a lot like a fish finder. I'm sure a lot of people that are listening are familiar with fish finders. The difference, though, is that a fish finder uses sound, it uses acoustics, and radar uses electromagnetics. But for those listening, if you've seen a fish finder readout, and not the little cheap ones that show you like a little goldfish or something symbol for the fish, or maybe the expensive ones too, I don't know. you'll see this hyperbolic target, which is like an upside-down U. And that's what rocks and the tops of coffins and other discrete objects will show up like that on the GPR screen. And someone who has experience interpreting it, like Dave, can read that and understand what's going on. I could go into more description of it, but what do you think, Sarah? We'll probably wrap it into the rest of the discussion here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be useful to talk a little bit about what it can and can't do. Like, what are the limitations of this technology? You're not like running it over the ground necessarily and seeing the outline of a coffin below ground, but that kind of thing. If you want to kind of just clarify that.
Sure, and that's a really good point. I mean, the thing when you see GPR on TV, most of the time, someone goes over, on a forensic show. A fictional forensic show, they'll go over a burial and you'll see pretty much a skeleton articulated with X's over the eyes, and the music CD that was buried with him or her, or they'll scan it, just do one pass over a concrete slab and there's a perfect image of a gun and you can read the serial number and the model, if only. But GPR doesn't really work that way. It's not like a doctor's room X-ray where you just kind of scan over it, go, GPR go, and you just let it fly around and do stuff and come back with a perfect image of the subsurface. It's a representation of what's going on under the ground. It'll show you if there are sufficient changes in the speed of the radar. Usually that's related to the amount of water in the ground. Then it'll show you representation of soil layers. For archaeology, it's super important, because if you're looking at those layers that I was mentioning, like in a backhoe trench, and someone has cut through those layers to put something in the ground, whether that's a clandestine burial from a forensic standpoint, or whether it's a formal burial in a cemetery, or in pre-contact native sites, perhaps a fire pit that's been dug down, a storage pit, or on historical sites, a well, anything that is excavated into the ground is going to cut through those soil layers. And like house foundations, like Dave was talking about earlier. And so one of the major things that we're looking for is when we see anomalies or inconsistencies in what's going on in the ground, that leads us to believe there's something there. And for objects like a grave, a coffin, whether it's concrete vault or a wooden casket, the top of that, you can think of the coffin itself as just one big object. And when we pass over it, we see that big hyperbolic target, or the upside-down U that looks like a fish, looks like a fish finding. And what we would do is we would look at it and say, okay, yeah, I got a hyperbolic target here. I know there's something here. But there's all kinds of stuff in the world that makes hyperbolic targets. Tree roots, animal burrows, cannonballs, whatever happens to be under the ground. And so the real scientific way to interpret it is to use the entire record and say, okay, I've got a target. Let me look at the soil layers above and around it and see if they're disturbed. If I don't see a disturbance above it, then more than likely it's just a natural rock or a tree root. But if I do see a disturbance above it, that's two pieces of evidence that tell me maybe there's something anthropogenic going on here. And the most important thing about it is that it's remote sensing. It rolls along the ground and it does less damage than a lawnmower. It doesn't cut grass, which a lot of people would really like that attachment, I guess.
For sure.
I think if you were to if you were to see the price of the lawnmower attachment for that, you'd probably get shocked. But no, my friend used to tell me, like, oh, how's the deep woods lawn mowing business going? Because I would post pictures on Facebook, me out in the woods. But the idea is it just rolls along the surface and it sends the signal into the ground. It puts out about 1% of the energy, the emissions that your cell phone does, so it's not frying leg hairs or burning earthworms or anything like that. Super safe, intrinsically safe. but it doesn't disturb anything. And that's the real key for archaeology. It's, we want to know what's in the ground, but that doesn't mean we want to dig everything up. We want to
Peter, Peter, I've noticed, in my dealings when we go out to do GPR on for people for different projects, they seem to think that no matter what the soil conditions, no matter what the landscape, that this is going to work. But there are very specific instances where this is probably not appropriate as much as circumstances where it is appropriate and effective, correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not a silver bullet, right? It can be in the right circumstances, but there are fundamental aspects of GPR that are suitable in certain circumstances and totally not in others. And for example, I mentioned earlier that I used to use seismic profiling in the ocean to look for drowned landscapes. Well, in the ocean, acoustic works just fine. But radar is electromagnetic. It is highly affected by conductivity. And so in the ocean, all the salt content makes ocean water really conductive. And if you were to use the radar antenna to look at the seafloor, all that energy would just go out into that conductive medium and just dissipate and not come back. But then again, if you were to use it in fresh water, it'd work great. On the other side, we have all these environmental variables, local environmental variables, daily variables that affect the way that GPR performs. But one of the biggest aspects of the success of surveys, two big aspects. One is water content. You need some water for GPR to perform really well. In soils, anyway. And too much water, like if you're walking along the site and your boots squish and you leave boot prints in the mud, that's probably a little bit too much water for the survey. Just wait for it to dry out. And so there are also other aspects. The texture of the soils, what the soils are made of. We've all held a handful of dirt, like whether we took it out of a bag of mulch, or a dry playground sand versus a handful of soil that we would take out from, the topsoil on our lawn. Sometimes it's really rocky, sometimes it's really clay-rich, sometimes it's just pure sand. And all of those different soil variables affect not only the way it holds water, but certain soils are more conductive. So if you were to do a GPR survey in certain types of clay, which we don't get as much around here in New England because it's glaciated, we don't have many true mineralogical clays, things that are the byproducts of ancient and long-term weathering processes. But we do have some clay. Those of you who live down on the coast of Connecticut, those of you who live on some of the major rivers, you may have dug down in your yard and found clay, like glacial-marine clay. Into the ocean, or maybe even. And those can be conductive materials. And so, you'll know in the field when you're pushing the GPR around, you see the data right on the screen. You'll know if you're getting pretty good data or you got to tweak some things. Sometimes you get a foot in real bad conditions and get 10, 15 feet. And that's an interesting point, too, is that equipment choice is really important. And just like anything, you don't see carpenters driving finish nails with a sledgehammer. There are the right tools for the right job, and it's no different. Most people have seen radar on TV. They may have seen that it's got a control unit and it's got a box on it, like an orange box. That's the antenna. But there isn't just one antenna. There's many of them. And it's all based on frequency in megahertz, just like the frequency on your radio dial, 104.7, whatever it happens to be. And typically, in most you use, the deeper you can go. But what ends up happening is you sacrifice resolution. If you want to see deep, you can't see small things. If I wanted to look down 30 or 50 feet, I'd have to use a really low frequency antenna. And I might not be able to resolve anything smaller than a 5-gallon bucket, or maybe even bigger than that. Whereas if I wanted to do a forensic search and investigate concrete, and I wasn't looking very deep, but I needed really high resolution, I could use a high-frequency antenna. And I could see every single piece of reinforcing wire in the concrete. But I'd only get down about a foot. So there are a lot of different variables in there. It's not just environmental variables. It's equipment choice and the knowledge of what tool to bring for any particular project, and what your end result, what you want your results to be.
So, in terms of archaeology, how do you know what you're looking at? I mean, how important is it to what are the limitations of this technology in terms of, can you figure out what's actually going on under the ground without excavation? Or are there situations where you absolutely have to, what we would call ground truth, by digging things up? And can you talk a little bit about just kind of the context of sites and how important that is to kind of interpreting GPR data?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like any remote sensing technology, GPR is going to give you some information that may or may not be interpretable. It may be quite ambiguous. It needs to be ground truth in most cases. The interesting thing about modern GPR technology is that there is a computer-based side of it where you can actually put the data into software and then clean it up. Dave's really good at that. And it's like anything. A professional photographer probably isn't going to just do all the work at the camera and then give you the photos. They're going to put them in Photoshop or some other advanced processing software, and that's what we have to do with GPR. But one of the things that we do to make the data more readable and more readily interpretable to the human eye is we put it through the software. A GPR profile, which is what you see on the screen when you're collecting, to a new user. I mean, a GPR profile just looks like a pilot-dead zebra. It's just black and white stripes. And it's kind of daunting at first, but you get experience with it. But what we do is and Dave champions this method, and this is what I've done for a long, long time, is I actually lay out a grid on a site, on an archaeological site. I collect evenly spaced profiles, let's say 1 foot apart, something like that. And I collect all these long profiles, 2D profiles, 2.5D, 2D profiles, and then stitch them together into a 3-dimensional cube of a survey area that I can then slice down through the ground like I was using a digital backhoe. And what this does, and it's really important for archaeology, is it shows the geometry of the features that are under the ground. Is it a circle? Is it a square? Is it a rectangle? And that helps the human eye kind of, because we all like pictures, right? Pictures are way better than text. We all know that. And it just helps to be able to see the shapes of things. And not only do you see the shape and the size and the configuration, you actually get to see how those relationships change with depth. And that's where GPR really just goes hand in hand with archaeology, because we're so interested in the context of the things we find. It's not just the arrowhead. It's not just the potsherd. It's not just the fire pit. It's what is associated with those objects and those features. And
right, and that's it.
Yep, go for it.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to jump in real quick, Peter. That's the thing that I was hoping we could talk about, too, is that one of the things that you and I have talked a lot about is how here in New England, we've got this 15 or, say, 16,000-year soil record. And a lot of times when we're running these GPRs for some of these sites, we find this sort of overprinting of, all these different features that are tree throws or some more modern historic features or possible shell middens. And one of the things that we then use the shovel test pit and or background research is to sort of dive into that context too. And that's what's so interesting, because sometimes you'll find archaeological features within some of these natural features too, like tree throws. And that's really where I think GPR shines, is helping you to find some of these different geometric shapes like you're talking about, and then use that documentary or other sort of context to sort of figure out what you've got to. And it's just another layer of evidence too.
Yeah, I mean, that's GPR is a fairly rapid way to give yourself a landscape scale context to the site, because the fire pit or the house, the cellar hole, is not the site. It's the landscape that we're occupying and using, and to be able to look at that scale just through archaeology alone would be cost prohibitive most of the time, and also destructive. Let's face it, right? Excavation is destructive. That's like what you learn on day one in your first archaeology class ever. And so to be able to put it into a landscape scale context, look at how things are arranged and potentially related laterally, and then to be able to look at how those relationships change with increasing depth, where some features will go away and then other ones will pop up. It's really powerful. And like I said, non-destructive. And I mean, I think that's one of the big things about it. And that's typically the approach to archaeology with radar, is that we try to do a large area so we can see the landscape.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and it's actually a really good lead-in to one of the sites that I wanted to talk about tonight. GPR was incredibly helpful at the Hollister site in Glastonbury, which is a site we've talked about several times on the show. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Hollister site is an incredibly well-preserved farm complex that dates from about 1650 to 1710, and the former state archaeologist Brian Jones was doing a big research project there, and he asked Peter to come out to the site back in about 2015 to use GPR to help survey the property to identify buried cultural features. So can you tell us a little bit about that site, Peter, the work that you did and what you found? Because in a lot of ways that it really guided the excavation strategy there, and it provided a much less destructive research strategy, because much less digging was required to actually identify these features, I think, because of the GPR.
Sure, yeah, that was an amazing site. Probably, like I said, I've done GPR all over the world, and that's right there in Hollister, Connecticut. That might be the Hollister site. It might be the best site I ever worked on with radar. Brian Jones had talked to me. I've known him for a long time, and I by the way, I miss him terribly. He talked to me, and I was doing a lot of GPR all over the place. And he said, get the site. The landowner is really jazzed up. Mark Packard was really jazzed up because it was his ancestral, the home of his ancestors, and he had some, I guess, documentary research that suggested there was a structure up there. And Brian said, yeah, we want to go out. And said, I don't know what it was. And Sarah and Dave, you can help me here. I mean, what was the size of the area? It was in horse pastures, 4 or 5 acres? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, it's big, yeah, at least.
And so Brian says, we're trying to find this one house. And it's probably from the 17th century. And, that's really exciting. It's a really exciting research avenue. But the other side of it is typically, and Sarah could talk a lot about this, typically 17th century sites don't generate a big artifact scatter, and it's not easy to find these sites. And sometimes the documentary research is really good, the maps are really good, sometimes they're not, and you're just a mile off. And so Brian said, we want to go find this one, we think there's one house out there. And I said, this sounds like fun, let's go do it. And so, a beautiful, beautiful property, horses running around and being nosy, like horses are, and just fun. And I turned on the equipment to set it up because you have to do, not really calibration, but you just have to map on when you get to a new site. You don't know the ground. You don't know how things are going to be. And the only way to figure it out is turn it on and go walk around. And I turned the GPR on, and I was looking at the screen, getting my depth settings and all that, and walked right over the most textbook house cellar hole that I've ever seen in GPR. And I told Brian, "There's your house. We've only been here about 10 minutes. What do you want to do? Should we just keep looking around?" And I knew it was a house, and I say, like, everything needs ground truthing, but there's some things that when you see them in our science and radar, it just can't be anything else. I couldn't tell the age of it, but I could tell it was a big soil cut in the ground. The site is on a beautiful floodplain soil with lots and lots of layers, stacked layers. And those layers were coming across, and then all of a sudden they just got cut and they stopped. And there looked like a stone wall. There were a bunch of those hyperbolic targets again. They were stacked up on top of each other. And then there was an area in the middle that was just kind of a mess. And then there was another wall, and then back into undisturbed soil layers. And I said, "Brian, this is it. I mean, it might not be the one you're looking for, but there's a house right here." And I made a hard left and just kept walking with the GPR, and Brian goes, "Yeah, we found it," and he's over there. And and all of a sudden, I'm walking, and I see another gigantic soil cut. And I said, "How many houses did you say were here, Brian?" He said, "There's supposed to be one big house out here." And I said, "Well, I think there's another one." And, Brian said, "I don't know." And so I got him, those of us who knew Brian, he's like, it's not really. And then we went over there, and we found another one, and then I made another hard left just to kind of mess around, and then there's a third one. And I said, "Brian, something's going on here. We need to do a big gridded survey." And like I mentioned before, of course, we want to, I know there's something amazing here. I just need to see the shape of it. I need to see what it does, where it goes, what it's related to. It's like a 100-meter by 30-meter survey. That's a 300-foot by 100-foot big rectangle. Didn't even, stop. When I got home with the data, I didn't stop to take a shower or anything like that. I just had to see it. And then as I was looking at that time slice that I mentioned earlier, where I can look at the 3D cube and slice down through the ground, I would slice it down through the top of the record, and I could see the plow zone where agricultural plowing had been happening in the historic period. And then 30, 40 centimeters down, a foot and a half, all of a sudden these gigantic squares, big black squares started to show up, and circles and all kinds of other things. And just in that small area, it turned out there were 3 house foundations, 2 6-foot diameter wells, 10 or 15 storage pits or privies. And it was just, I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen anything like it before. I don't know if I'll ever see anything like it again.
That was a fantastic. It's a fantastic image, and anyone who has had a chance to had a chance to see Brian speak on Hollister or Connecticut Archaeology, or follow him on his OSA Facebook page. That image was one that he really fell in love with because it's so phenomenal. People can look at that, and if you can't tell that there's a cellar there, then there's something wrong with you. And I think, Peter, that if I may say, that not that he was skeptical of the technology, but that really made him start to think about how that should almost be a standard part of the archaeological toolkit when they're out on a site. That information led him to be able to set up his grid, set up his excavation strategy. I mean, we still went in areas where it didn't appear to be anything to ground truth that and confirm what we were seeing on the GPR. But I think that really made him a believer in GPR as a standard part of the archaeological toolbox.
Yeah, and this happens quite frequently because one of the issues that emergent technology has is the first editions, I would say, the first version of some technology didn't have all the bugs worked out of it. The technology hadn't improved yet. GPR was used on archaeology sites in the mid to late 80s. And at that time, the first GPR that was made by our company, we made the first commercial GPR back in 1970, 72. For those of you listening, who were around at that time, had you ever heard of a storage drive, like a disk drive or anything like that? These things, they didn't have their own batteries. The battery technology wasn't there. There wasn't a computer that you were able to just pull out of your backpack, and look at the data. These things were big and bulky. They had to be powered off a car battery. They would actually burn the record into thermal paper, like a seismograph, kind of, and it would smoke the car out, and it stank. And you couldn't store the data. It was only printed out on paper, and so there were knobs and tubes. I mean, you had to be a dyed-in-the-wool, a PhD geophysicist to read the data. Then you had to be a PhD mechanical engineer to fix it. But it was these types of systems, and a couple of maybe one or two generations later, that people were starting to use on archaeology sites.
Hey, I'm gonna jump in and hit the pause button if that's okay with everybody. I just want to jump in and give everybody a chance to catch their breath. We got so much more to cover on Archaeology of Connecticut, but first we want to thank those people that allow us to do what we do here on ICRV Radio. We got more from Sarah and her team coming up right after this. In each episode of All Things Green, powered by the Rockfall Foundation, Executive Director Tony Marino sits down with environmental leaders of Connecticut to gain insights on what listeners like you can do to help our environment. Like when Tony visited with Alicia Sharma, Executive Director of the Connecticut Rivers Alliance, to learn more about how water conservation can start at the home and everyone can help.
From a water standpoint, pay attention to all of the recommendations for, how to keep your lawn in such a way that it isn't going to impact water quality. Don't use as much fertilizer. Don't use pesticides, and also make sure that you're using your water wisely in your own home. Water conservation in the home is important. And pay attention. Pay attention to what's going on around you.
Be part of the conversation. Go to rockfallfoundation.org or simply join us and listen in to All Things Green every Thursday at 4 p.m. on ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the river valley where we make local matter. And welcome back, everybody, to Archaeology of Connecticut.
Okay, we're here with Dave Leslie and Peter Leach talking about GPR and archaeology. We were talking about the Hollister site a little bit. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to add about that before we move on to a new topic?
Oh, I was just mentioning that the reason that, we mentioned that Brian Jones, former state archaeologist, was a little skeptical about GPR is because people used it in the early days of the technology, the late 80s. And the technology just wasn't there yet, and everyone wanted it to be a digital trowel. They just wanted it to just what it was. And a lot of people kind of got a bad taste in their mouth about it, and institutional developed it, and it stuck with people, and advisors passed it down to their students, and then they passed it down to their students. And so I've done a lot of damage control over the years. And a lot of that has been doing experimental work with GPR to really try to push the boundaries. And I think that that we could dovetail into some other uses of GPR and archaeology, kind of along those lines. What's possible now?
Yeah, and I think that's another great segue to another important site that we've talked a lot about on this program, which is the Paleo-Indian site in Avon, Connecticut, that is named after the late state archaeologist Brian Jones. Now, Dave, you led the excavations at that site, and you used GPR there in a very different way to collect different kinds of information. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So for those of you who have listened to the show or read about the site, as Sarah said, it's a Paleo-Indian site that was named for the late state archaeologist. It's actually the oldest site in Connecticut at about 12,500 years old. And one of the really interesting aspects of the site isn't necessarily its age, but that it's buried about 5 to 6 feet below the current ground surface, and it's adjacent to the Farmington River. That doesn't sound so interesting, but here in New England, we have this sort of received wisdom from other archaeologists who have looked for old Paleo-Indian sites, and the idea is that sites, not that people wouldn't have been near rivers, it's just that rivers during this 10 to 15,000 year period were so unstable that they would have eroded most of the activity that was left by people at these sites. That's not the case at this site, and it's not the case at another site in Connecticut, the Templeton site. And so one of the things that we knew when we found this site was this is incredibly rare. There are only 2 or 3 deeply buried sites in all of the Northeast. And so what we wanted to do was understand what archaeologists call the site formation processes that were happening at the site. So how was the site preserved? And then how can we use that information? If we can understand how this site was preserved, can we predict where other sites might be too? Because the Paleo-Indian period is a period that's really underrepresented in the archaeology of this region. There are a few sites. That could be because there were a few people, but it could be because we're looking in some of the wrong places too. So one of the things that we did with Peter and also with the UConn Geoscience team was devise a way to use the GPR as sort of a landscape perspective that Peter was talking about. So we used our GPR, and we also had Peter come down as well to do a long transect from the ground surface and look at the layers from the ground surface down to where the site was. And what we could see was a bunch of these alluvial or river-deposited layers that were sort of crystal clear. You could see the different stratigraphic breaks with them. But then we went farther, and we used a what's called a vibrocore system, where we take, it sounds complicated, but you just take an aluminum shaft and you vibrate it with a concrete head mixer that's attached to a gas generator to create enough to reduce the friction so that you can push the core into the soil and remove a geologic core relatively simply, and then you can get a nice profile of 6 to 7 feet. Now, that's usually done in aquatic settings because the friction is much less. Here we were doing it by hypersaturating the area. Again, we just took some water and sort of splashed it on the surface for about 20 minutes. We weren't sure that was going to work, but it worked great. And we were able to take those cores and compare them to the GPR profile, and we can see the exact stratigraphic breaks where we thought they would be too. And it's really helping us understand not only the site formation processes, but target where to do this coring program too. If we hadn't had the GPR, it would have been not sort of we wouldn't have been in the dark, but it would have been much more laborious. We would have had to take many more cores. And that's something, these cores are only a couple inches in diameter, but we want to have as small of an impact as possible because we don't want to impact potential archaeological resources that far down too. We also use the GPR in sort of the more traditional ways that Peter was talking about to do a whole plan-wide survey of the site itself. And one of, I think, the most striking things that we can see here is that when the site is preserved on the river, and there's a river terrace or levee that protected the site. The river was constrained in its position for over 16,000 years. And when we did this plan view GPR of the site itself, you can see that river migrating as you move down in slices through elevation. So you can see physically where the edge of the terrace was, where people might have sat 12,500 years ago, looking out at the river, building their campfires. We can see some of the features that would have been campfires that we've come to expect from this great technology. And Peter actually came on site with GPR unit we haven't talked a lot about today, his mini GPR, which I think we'll talk about when we get to Jamestown too, where he ran it over and looked at some of our features. And that's another aspect of the Brian Jones site that I could talk forever about, is that we have 27 cultural features preserved there, which is as incredible as finding 4 house cellars at the Hollister site in the 17th century. There's both two highly unlikely things that were found in the last 5 or 6 years in Connecticut, showing that Connecticut is really sort of leading the way in exposing and excavating some of these really interesting sites.
You know what I thought was really interesting. You know what I thought was really interesting about the Avon site, Dave, or the Jones site, was the correlation that you saw between your core samples and then your GPR data to help you kind of establish that 12,500-year-old landform that they were sitting on. I thought that the correlation was just remarkable.
Sure, and one of the things that I forgot to even mention is that using the GPR data, we were able to target this back area behind the site where we now think there was a wetland that was developing at the same time, which is an added reason why people were there, too. So we have a developing wetland soil. We haven't radiocarbon dated it yet, but we imagine that it will come back to be about the same date as the site, too, and shows sort of an extra reason why they were there. And again, it's the correlation between all three of those things, the excavation, the GPR, and then the vibrocoring and geologic coring, that allows us to really create this holistic picture of what was happening in the past.
Yeah, and I think one thing I might add to that is that, you know, for the non-archaeologists out there, non-geologists, you know, walking around on a landscape, it's hard to imagine that even millennia that it's changed that much. And when you do a lot of archaeology, you dig holes in the ground, you see that, especially on the floodplain that Dave's talking about, at Brian Jones site, you go out there today and it's pretty flat, right, Dave?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's just a very slight slope is all that you see. And then the river is about 10 to 12 feet below the terrace. So there's an existing terrace where the river has cut in. But you look at that and you say, oh, the river is meandering, it's just cut down, you know, and it has moved a lot. And that's just not true.
Yeah, and if you were to take a giant vacuum and suck up all the floodplain sands from there to get down to that where the Paleo-Indian level is, that would be a wildly different landscape, different topography. And like you said, you know, like, gosh, 10 feet below the surface or something, or 8 feet. It's very deep, right?
Yeah, it's very deep. I mean, and it was sort of a sandy pine environment probably then too. So a completely different environment, completely different soils than what we have today too.
Yeah, and your use of GPR there was, you know, you were like wearing your geology hat, right? Like go from as far away from the river as you can get and go down towards it and see how, you know, remote sensing-wise, how that landscape has changed. And it's changed a lot, like a lot of places have.
Yeah, and that's really the key to this site, is that it's, you know, we're envisioning it sort of as a type site to compare with Templeton, and that will help inform us about where other sites might be too.
Yeah, and this is great too. I think it really showcases, you know, archaeology as a discipline and how it works, all these different pieces that fit together. We take a little bit of geology, we have our archaeological methods, we have these geophysical methods, and when you put it all together, you can get this incredibly rich picture of the past. But if any one of those pieces is missing, you really only have part of the story. So we're starting to run out of time, but there's a couple of other things I wanted to talk about tonight. We've talked about kind of big kind of site survey methods. We've talked about landscape reconstruction with the Avon site. But, Peter, you've also done some work using GPR at kind of a more micro level, I guess, to examine individual cultural features from posts and pits and burials. Can you talk a little bit about some of the sites you've worked on and what you've learned that way?
Sure, yeah. GPR works at what I like to call a shovel scale versus a trowel scale. And I sort of mentioned this earlier when I was talking about different antennas, the GPR antennas. The traditional way of looking at archaeological sites with GPR is to use a mid-range antenna, not that anyone really cares, but 400 megahertz, something like that, gives you a good combination of good depth, but also decent resolution for archaeology. We can get the depth that we want, and we can see things we want to see. That's what I call a shovel scale. And that's what I've done for a long time, but lately I've been doing some experimentation at what I call the throttle scale, and I've been using these really, really high-frequency antennas that are really only supposed to be used on concrete, because you can see small stuff, but you're not expecting to look super deep, maybe a foot. But I've been using those because they're smaller. There's an antenna that fits right in the palm of your hand. It's like the size of like a kind of a large ring box. It'll fit right in the palm of your hand. And I wanted to use those on archaeological sites, not to do what's normally done, where the GPS survey is done and then you hand a map to someone, make the whole landscape, and say, here's where the stuff is, and then go home. I wanted to see if we could use GPR in real time while we were excavating. So GPR down in the pit, right alongside the archaeologist. So our trowel in one hand, radar antenna in the other one. And so I started to do that, and luckily with Dave and Sarah's help and other archaeologists in New England, I started to the former state archaeologist in New Hampshire, Dick Bovair. I started to be able to get access to some sites to try this out. And the real major site that really advanced the method for me and in the discipline was working at the Jamestown Rediscovery in Jamestown, Virginia. And I worked down there with the National Park Service, volunteering with them, and we found a fort. Bill Griswold, Meg Waters, National Park Service, Dave Givens, the director of archaeology at Jamestown Rediscovery. And we found this really cool fort from the 1660s. And when we were kind of cleaning up, I looked at Dave Givens and said, look, if you're ever doing renovations on a church or something and you find a Euro-American burial, a colonial burial that is being impacted by sea level rise or whatever, and you have to zoom it to prevent any further damage from the environment, let me know, because I have this tiny little radar antenna I want to try. And, you mentioned, that, Scott mentioned that Brian was skeptical of the GPR. Well, there's real skepticism about this new method, but for pushing the envelope. But anyway, they did have a burial that was going to be impacted by church renovations, and sea level rise is a big problem at Jamestown right now. And they had to remove it to prevent further decay and damage. And so they excavated down to 6 inches, 4 inches above the collapsed coffin bed. And I said, well, we're going to try this. And the reason I wanted to try it is because, back to talking about how, forensic show GPR, you're really not supposed to be able to find bones with GPR. First of all, the antennas that people use just aren't high enough frequency. They don't have the resolution. But second of all, the crystalline structure of human bone lend itself to the reflection of electromagnetic energy, radar energy. And so I went down there, and a lot of people were like, yeah, you can try it, but whatever, the textbooks say you can't do it. And so we did, we surveyed. I did a grid like I've been talking about, but I didn't do it across 100 meters. I did a little tiny grid that was 2 meters long, and I did individual profiles on that grid at 2 centimeter intervals. And we sliced down through it using that digital backhoe technique that I mentioned, and we actually captured the articulated skeleton. For the first time in the history of GPR, we actually proved that you can see skeletal remains with it, and there's a long ways to go. It's like it needs a lot more work, but that was a really big success with that tiny antenna that's not supposed to go anywhere near dirt. But we also did this a little bit at the Brian Jones site, and we did some of this at Hollister, where burial's one thing, but what about features, or for those of you who are familiar with the term, I mean, a feature for archaeologists is anything that's, human constructed, anthropogenic, that just can't be picked up and taken out of the site, like a fire pit, a storage pit. And the other archaeologists on the line, I mean, when we see these things in the ground with our eyes, we don't always know what they are. They're just soil things. Sometimes they're rodent burrows, sometimes they're tree falls, but I've been doing a lot of research to try to see if we can cut these in half digitally and use it as a mission planning tool, a non-destructive mission planning tool during excavation. And I think that's kind of, I'd like to see, GPR and archaeology kind of going in that direction, not abandoning the landscape scale because that's extremely valuable, but maybe starting to get down in the trenches and be part of the excavation with a digital travel.
Hey, Sarah, it might be a good time to do one lap around the virtual roundtable for just last thoughts, because we got about 70 seconds.
Oh, boy. Anybody have any final comments? There's so much to talk about.
I'd just quickly say that what Peter's talking about is I really think the future of this. It is going to be, he's got the glass boat now with the mini XT that he's using, and he's able to see and bisect these features digitally, and that's really the future, and it's something that I'm incredibly excited about.
Yeah, I think what I was saying before kind of still holds true. I think this is a technology that is just starting to be tapped, and I think it should be. I think it is critical to get it more out in the field so that it's used on more sites to help direct and support archaeologists in the field.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of skepticism, as everybody was talking about. You run into all kinds of roadblocks when you try to apply it to sites and compliance situations. But I think that we're slowly breaking down the barriers, and this type of research is hugely important for that. Well, thanks, everybody. This was great. I feel like we could probably have a whole other show on GPR and cover all this and other aspects about it. But thanks for being on tonight. This is a great show.
Yeah, and real quick, guys, listeners, if you can go online and look up the Jamestown skeleton and Peter Leach, and you'll see an image that's really fantastic. You really should take a look at it if you haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I just want to say, closing, I mean, the technology is one thing, and we're advancing it all the time, but it's actually the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, regional and interregional collaborations that are making all of these advances happen. And it's everyone that's on the line right now that's been working together. And I really hope that we continue to push the envelope together in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that is a perfect stopping point, and I want to thank everybody for being part of ICRV Radio. I want to thank everybody for keeping Brian Jones' spirit and vision alive and well as we surpass 35,000 listeners just for this program, Archaeology of Connecticut. Over 35,000 people listened last month, and any given day, over 400 people are listening in the Anytime Listening archive. So if you missed any part of this and you want to catch it again, check out the archive on icrvradio.com. And thank you, everybody, for Archaeology of Connecticut.